All right. Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Neighborhood Author Series hosted by the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library. My name is Ben Spohn, and today I'm interviewing Josh Hitchens, author of Haunted History of Delaware, Haunted History of Philadelphia, and most recently, Eerie Delaware. So, Josh, thank you for sitting down with me today. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It is my pleasure to be here.
Before we start getting into some more specific questions about your latest book, Eerie Delaware, perhaps you can say something about your general background as well as your first two volumes that you've produced.
Sure thing. So I was born and raised in Sussex County, Delaware, around Georgetown, Laurel area, where most of my family still lives today. And from a very early age, I was always very interested both in history and also with ghost stories and folklore, both fiction and nonfiction. And, grew up watching Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon, things like that. And I went to college at Arcadia University, which is right outside of Philadelphia, for theater, and I still do theater. So I stopped writing for a while. But then around, I want to say, 2017 or so, I started a podcast called Going Dark Theater, which I researched and wrote. And it started off being about my favorite haunted places all over the world, and then dived into some of my favorite unsolved mysteries and things like that. So that kind of got the writing side of me activated again, and the research historian side of me activated again. And then in 2020, when the lockdown happened, I um, was working at a museum. Most of my day jobs have been working at, historic sites and museums in the Philadelphia area for the past 20 years or so. And so, I had nothing to do during the lockdown. I was like, how am I going to spend my time? And I remembered a publishing company called The History Press, which is also known as Arcadia Publishing. They have a series called Haunted America of hundreds of books by local authors from all across the United States. And I noticed that they didn't have a book about Delaware ghost stories and legends. And so I went on their website, and they had at the bottom a tab that said, Make me an author. And I filled out a form. And about 2 weeks later, I had a contract and a deadline. That became my first book, Haunted History of Delaware. Similarly, they didn't have a book about Philadelphia ghost stories, which was even more surprising to me, since Philadelphia is like, major city and like tons of history there. And so Haunted History of Philadelphia followed a year later. And then Eerie Delaware came out in 2024. And unlike Haunted History of Delaware and Haunted History of Philadelphia, Eerie Delaware is more of a mix of different things. There are ghost stories, but has other stuff in it as well. So that it was really fun to write all of them. But Eerie Delaware was fun because I got to sort of stretch about like topics that I could write about.
It's always interesting to hear about getting to do new things. How did you stretch for this one?
Really kind of going back to the Going Dark Theater podcast roots, featured some true crime stories in Erie, Delaware. There is one of them in Haunted History of Delaware as well, the chapter on Patty Cannon, which has no supernatural elements in that chapter at all. It's just the real horrific history of it. And so it was great to dive into that kind of territory again with Erie, Delaware, and to really go back to the primary, like with a lot of these stories, go back to the primary source materials, newspaper articles from, the 19th century and things like that, and uncovering lots of things that, haven't necessarily been written about before, with some of these stories. So that was a big thrill to do. And also to write about the UFO alien encounters in Delaware. And also, I wrote a chapter about Frightland as well, which is the amazing haunted house attraction in Middletown. Yeah, so it was fun to reach out in different ways.
Yeah. Can you say anything more about your research process? Do you have any favorite sources or archives?
That's a great question. I mean, the Delaware Public State Archive is an amazing resource and has been very helpful to me. Books that have come back to again and again in researching Delaware. There are two that are my favorites. The first is um, Delaware: A Guide to the First State, which was published in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration, where they sent people and reporters, journalists throughout every corner of the state of Delaware, and they interviewed people and wrote about all these historic sites. So it really is an incredible collection of history that, if that project hadn't happened, a lot of those stories would be lost to time, which is why I think doing this kind of work is so necessary and important, because it preserves these stories and passes them on to new generations. Another book I really love, which is out of print now, but you can find used copies of it, is a book called Folklore of Sussex County, Delaware, which was written by a woman named Dorothy Williams Pepper, and that was published in 1976. And again, like preserves all this, stories and culture from Sussex County, again, things that would be lost if Dorothy Pepper hadn't written them down. So like those have been two great sources for me. And also just going into, old newspaper archives, things like that. And, reading books that other folks have written as well, because there are many, many wonderful authors who have written about Delaware history and folklore that have come before me, that were huge influences, especially the late Ed Okonowitz, who wrote his 9-volume Spirits Between the Bays series in the 1990s. I grew up reading those books. I got to meet him at a ghost tour at Port Delaware once, but he really did, I think, more than anyone else, such great work preserving like history and legends from throughout the state.
Yes, I was pleasantly surprised too to see a name I read a lot growing up in your bibliography with Charlie Adams and David Siebold.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Love them. Love their work too.
So I guess what I'd like to get at with this podcast too, since we're focused on more local history, is why Delaware? What's the draw? What is the mystery and the allure of the first state?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. I think Delaware gets overlooked a lot, because we are a small state, of course, but there is such rich, rich history with Delaware, because the European founding of it goes all the way back to the 1600s, with towns like Lewis and Old Newcastle and things like that. So there's such a span of American history in Delaware. And even though it is a small state, as I'm sure everyone listening to this knows, there is such a huge variety of kinds of places. Like up north, you have a more metropolitan area. Then, you go down to the south and, it's very rural. And there's also our amazing beaches as well. So the state really opens itself up to a lot of wonderful history, and with wonderful history, ghost stories and always follow, I think.
And why through the lens of ghosts and folklore in general? You'd mentioned having an interest in that from very early on, but what triggered that interest?
I mean, I think that we all enjoy being scared a little bit, and your mileage may vary, of course, but for me, it really goes back to the beginnings of storytelling, really, way, way, way back, like once we learn how to talk to each other, like sitting around a campfire and telling stories. That's how we connect. It's how we communicate with one another. And there's not and ghost stories are a wonderful way, sort of a trap door into history, I think, because a lot of people, even if they might not be interested in history or like aren't interested in going to museums and things like that, like once they hear like, oh, this place is haunted, like people get curious, like, oh, like who is haunting it, why is it haunted, and you learn about that, and in learning about that it leads you into, okay, why is this place important, what happened here, why is it significant, and it sort of opens up, a whole world to you. Like I started doing, where it started for me, like my historian path was really when I was a kid, like 10 or 11. My grandparents would volunteer at Old Christ Church near Laurel, which is an incredible, incredible historic site. And I memorized their little guidebook, and I started at, age 10, 11, taking people around and, telling them about the history, things that they never would have noticed before, and I found that thrilling. And yeah, it's just a wonderful, wonderful path of work.
Can you say anything more about Old Christchurch? Because for a lot of our listenership that's based more in Newcastle County and the greater Philadelphia area, Christchurch probably means the Episcopalian church that's right outside of our gates at the library at Hagley. So I know it's two very different places.
Absolutely, yes. So Oak Christ Church dates back to the early 1700s, and it is really extraordinarily preserved. Like it is all the original structure, all the original wood. It's never been painted. There's never been electricity. There's never been a restroom in there, So like you walk into it, and it really is like you are transported back in time 300 years ago. And on some of the old wooden pews, like you can still see remnants of, chalk writings. People, wrote their family name in their pew, and there's some hex signs on the pews as well. And it has a wonderful, beautiful and also spooky little graveyard outside of it as well. But it is just extraordinarily well preserved. It's not an active congregation any longer, but they do still, there's an organization called the Old Christ Church League, which you can find information about them online for anyone who's listening. And they do open up the church for visiting hours and tours on select weekends. They do have several special events there, some special church services there, but it's an amazing, amazing place. Astonishingly well preserved.
Yes, and there's a whole chapter about it in your first book.
There is, yes. And that was a happy accident, because I was going to write about Old Christ Church, and like my introduction to haunted history of Delaware. Again, like I've explained here, sort of how it was kind of the beginning of what set me on this career path. And I contacted the Old Christ Church League, which is run by a wonderful woman named Stacy Northam Smith, just to see if I could get, more historical information about it, because I hadn't been there in many years, and told her that I was writing the book I was writing. She's like, "Oh, it is haunted. We have ghost stories here that people have experienced." And so that turned into a whole chapter in the book. Ended up being the final chapter in the book rather than at the beginning. Felt nice full circle moment.
And it sounds deeply personal.
Oh yeah, it is, and I think that's one of the special things about Arcadia Publishing, which has released my three books, is that with all of their books, not just in the Haunted America series, but every kind of topic they have, they want authors who are local to the area, who have a personal connection with the place. And I think there's something really special about that, because even though I've lived now in Philadelphia longer, about 20 years, versus the 18 that I lived in Delaware, Delaware is still home to me. And I have a great love and pride for being from Delaware, and, being able to tell people about its history and the legends that come out of it is a great joy.
Home is where the heart is, after all.
Absolutely.
Would it be fair to say then that that might be, well, let me back up for a second. Because I know I said we would try to stay more focused on your most recent book. What's your favorite chapter in that one?
Favorite chapter in Eerie, Delaware?
Yeah, or either or, since I went and opened the door on your first book too.
I am in Erie, Delaware. Uh, I am very, very proud of the chapter I wrote, and it's another one of the true crime chapters. It's called A Year of Terror on Route 40, and it deals with the Route 40 serial killer, whose name I won't mention because I don't like, giving him attention. But that chapter is instead of being focused on the serial killer, which is what you so often find in true crime. I instead focused on the lives of the five women that he killed, because they have amazing life stories and are hugely missed, and they often do not get the focus in coverage about those events. So I really wanted to do that. It was a very hard chapter emotionally to write, but I'm very, very proud of what came out of it. And on the ghost story side in Erie, Delaware, I also love the first chapter in the book, which was the genesis for the book, really. The first chapter is called Haunted House in Hockessin, and came about because I was working at a Victorian house museum in Philadelphia called the Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion, and they were selling copies of Haunted History of Delaware there. And a woman came to an event. Her name was Diane Fleming. She saw my book and she said, "Oh, I lived in a haunted house in Delaware for 13 years." And I said, could you write down your name and contact information? I'd love to talk to you. And so I had a long phone interview with her, over an hour, where she told me about all of the creepy things that had happened in her house, for the 13 years she lived there. And this is a modern story, right? Like, she moved into the house New Year's Day in the year 2000. And so many ghost stories are, of course, about like things that have happened in the past, sometimes the very distant past. So to have to, again, like, happy accident or synchronicity to stumble upon a person who had this contemporary ghost story of, just an ordinary house, like, not doesn't look like looks like any other house on the road, doesn't look like a big creepy haunted mansion or anything, but had all these like crazy scary things happen there. So I love that story too. That was very special.
So as you're putting together these books, as you're writing, um, would you be willing to say anything about the editorial process? What does and what doesn't make the cut?
Yeah, absolutely. I always think that it's such an interesting journey, right? Writing books, and with all three of the books that I've written so far, because with Arcadia Publishing, like, as part of your proposal, they ask you for like a table of contents, basically, like an outline of what you're thinking of writing about in the book. And for all three of the books that I've written, there have been chapters that I intended to write about that didn't make the cut for different reasons. Sometimes it's uh, just about sort of the shape and formatting of the book in terms of like different kinds of stories, because you want to flow, you don't want too much repetition in things, you don't want like five haunted house chapters in a row, for instance. Like, you want like a haunted house, and then there's a haunted tavern or a haunted park, things like that. So sometimes it's about just what fits as the book begins to take shape. And there are some chapters that I just couldn't find my way into as a writer. And there is an example of that with Erie, Delaware, because there was one chapter I had intended to put in it, that didn't make it. And it was going to be about Cordelia Botkin, who was convicted of the Dover poison candy murders, that happened in 1895, which is a fascinating story. And there are two great books written about it. One was written in the 1970s, one was written about 10 years ago. And I just couldn't figure out how to enter into that story as a writer. Because there's so many moving pieces, and it's, and there's questions like, was Cordelia Botkin actually the person who did this, or was she not? And I just the deadline was approaching, and I just couldn't figure out how to tackle it. So it didn't end up being in the book. And it also, I think, would have been one true crime story too many in Eerie, Delaware. Might have tipped the balance a little bit too much. In that direction. But I do hope to write about that case in something one day, because I do think it's a fascinating and macabre piece of history.
I was going to ask if there was any chance for volume three and if you had left any darlings on the cutting room floor, but it seems you beat me to the punch on both counts.
Yeah, I do. I do definitely plan on writing more about both Delaware and Philadelphia someday. Not sure when that will be. I do think that my next book, when when its time comes, is going to be a full length book about a true crime case in Delaware. I won't say which one yet, just in case someone steals it from me. But that, I think that's where my writer heart is leaning next, because I do really enjoy, doing the research and the writing about those kinds of things, because again, it lifts up people who are sometimes forgotten or are not the spotlight. So I think that'll be the next thing when the time is right.
Interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that. Do you see yourself going then more in the true crime direction, or do you think you'll ever return to ghosts and the supernatural?
Oh, absolutely will. And I'm planning on uh, trying to self-publish a book, hopefully sometime early next year. Um, so with the going, I mentioned near the beginning of our conversation the Going Dark Theater podcast, which got me back into writing. I'm very proud of a lot of that work. Both the ghost stories I wrote about, and also like the unsolved mysteries and horrific history. The tagline for that podcast, which my partner came up with, was "Finding the humanity behind the horror," which is really kind of always what I'm about. Like, it's never, I write about like gruesome things sometimes and scary things sometimes, but the focus is, it's never to sensationalize or disgust. Like, it's always to focus on the people involved. So I do plan on collecting all of that material into its own book as well, because I think it's a body of work that I'm very proud of, and I think I want to get that out there before I move forward to something new.
And just thinking about maybe this is a strange one, but the future of haunted history in general. I mean, Delaware is a rapidly changing state. In particular, the further south one goes, there's a lot more people in Sussex County now than what there were 5, 10, 20 years ago. Do you think that's going to change how you approach this type of work as the rest of the state changes so much?
Mm, that's a great question, great thing to bring up. Yeah, because I Sussex County, as you said, is changing very rapidly. Like, every time I go down to visit with family, I there are so many houses and developments that were not there the last time I was there. Um, and I think, and I think there's good sides and bad and negative sides to more people and such. But I think it makes this kind of work even more important, is kind of why I do it, is because time does march on, and history continues forward, and things change. Old buildings are demolished, new ones are created. So I think that's why it's so important to preserve a lot of these stories, because, if you don't do that, then they just disappear and no one remembers. And these stories, I think, are so valuable because, even with a ghost story or an urban legend, of which there are many great ones of those in Delaware too, they always point to, I think, where we are as a culture, as a society. What are the things on our minds? What are our anxieties? What is sticking in the back of our brains? And these stories are a way to address those things in a way that is more palatable, I think, to people. And so I think, even as the state changes, it's even more reason to do the kind of work I do.
So before I go into my final planned question for today, I'd like to open up the floor and just ask, is there anything else you'd like to add about any of your books? Um, any ghost stories, anything like that before I do the thing?
Yeah, and I guess I would say, the three books I've written so far, Haunted History of Delaware, Haunted History of Philadelphia, and Eerie Delaware, they really do feel like a trilogy to me in a way, both in that they reflect my own journey as a writer and reconnecting with my roots in Delaware and, explaining my roots in Philadelphia now. But the history of Delaware and Philadelphia and Pennsylvania at large are so intertwined. Like in all three books, there are threads and references between them, and I think that's a really special thing. So I think, it's good to read all three of them, in order, especially because they kind of feel like, a complete arc of work for me.
I think that is absolutely the case, and I can second that as we're sitting here on this Monday morning recording a podcast about Delaware, and we're both in Pennsylvania. So,
Yeah,
okay then. So, my final planned question: do you believe in ghosts?
I do. Yes. So yeah, I've not to get too much into it, but I've always been kind of sensitive to that side of things. Like from the time I was pretty young, like seeing things in different places and different kinds of experiences. When I was on a field trip in fifth grade, we went to Fort Delaware. And we were in the area, which people call the dungeons because that it looks like that, but it's actually the casemates where they stored ammunition. And I suddenly became aware that I had lost my group. Like my teacher in the class had moved on, and I was all alone in this dark hallway. And me being like a good like fifth grader, I was like, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble. And then I heard voices, talking down the hall. So I followed where the voices were, and it led me to a doorway, in the casemates. That was a metal door, like old rust and rusty, and had a little, grate in the middle of it with bars and where you could look into the room. And I looked into the room and I saw two men sitting at a table and they were talking. And one, saw like just two like people, just like looking at you right now. One was a man in a Union uniform, and across the table from him was a man in a ragged gray remnants of a Confederate uniform. And then they stopped talking and they turned and looked at me. And there's lots of reenactors at Fort Delaware. It is a living history site. So I was like, oh, I'm interrupting a rehearsal. I shouldn't be here. So I left, found my class again, and then, asked the tour guide, at our next stop. I was like, oh, I saw like the Union and the Confederate, guy taught, rehearsing in the cell. And his face went white. And he said, we don't have any Confederate reenactors at Fort Delaware. and there's those doors are rusted shut. You can't get inside those rooms. And that's when I realized that what I had seen were ghosts. So that made a big impression, of course. And that's a reason too, like the Fort Delaware chapter is the first chapter in Haunted History of Delaware, because that was a big moment for me. And I've done the ghost tour in Philadelphia for almost 18 years now, guided walking tour, and have, experienced things on that tour, and being inside those places. So yeah, I do believe. And I have no prejudice against anyone who does not believe in ghosts or is skeptical. There's room for everyone at the table, and I always feel like whether you believe in ghosts or not, you can still enjoy a good ghost story, enjoy it for what it is.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate that answer. And as someone who's still on the fence about belief in that type of thing, I appreciate the welcome. Um, I really do. So before I play us out, is there anything you'd like to plug?
Sure thing. Let me see. So, if you are around the Philadelphia area, I one of the other spooky things I do is I am also a horror host in Philadelphia. My horror host name is Josh Hitchens, which was given to me by that was coined for me by a friend. I was like, oh yeah, that's great. And so I have a monthly show every first Monday of the month at Star Garden Recreation Center, which is at 6 and Lombard Streets in Old City, Philadelphia, where I host some of the best and the worst horror movies ever made. Give again with my research brain on, like talk about like how the movie was made and interesting trivia about it, and then we watch the movie and I'll comment during it. The audience will comment during it, because I always feel that horror, whether it's film or it's a story or a TV show, whatever, it brings people together in a way that I think is very special. There's something very communal about being scared together, and then you realize you're all together, and then you laugh. There's connection, and connection is something that, and community is something that we need these days. So if you're around Philadelphia area, I do that every first Monday of the month, and it's a good time.
Sounds it. And for anyone out there listening, if you'd like to hear more of what we do, you can check us out at hagley.org. We have a sister series to this podcast where we talk to researchers who've been through Hagley's collections. And if you'd like to buy any of Josh's books and you're in the Wilmington area, I can recommend checking out Huxley and Hiro downtown Wilmington. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.